But I think the biggest thing is just to don't undervalue yourself. You bring so much value to the table. Once you recognize the unique, value that you're bringing and you're able to speak confidently about it, you're going to do totally fine.
Hello, happy Wednesday, and welcome back to another episode of Make Up Your Mind. I'm your host, Jahleane, and today we have another really fantastic guest. I'm super excited because it is my friend Gianna Prudente, and she is a trailblazer in her own right. She is the first ever early career development editor at LinkedIn, talking about all things Gen Z, sharing her personal experiences, and building an amazing platform while doing so. And she's also the new co-host of LinkedIn's new Gen Z focused podcast called Let's Talk Offline, where she has candid conversations with her co-hosts and other Gen Zers about all things being Gen Z in the workplace and the trials and tribulations that you go through. So, Gianna, welcome to the podcast.
Oh my God. First off, that was the nicest intro ever. And I am so excited to be here. This is like literally the highlight of my week. I've been looking forward to it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, me too. Gianna, so let's get started. Gianna, like I mentioned, is a fellow Gen Zer and she has a very interesting post-grad journey. So would you like to walk us through what your post-grad journey has been like and also just building a career for yourself in journalism, specifically in tech?
Yes. Okay. So the post-grad journey has had lots of ups and downs. But to take a step back, getting into journalism and in tech. So I studied journalism all 4 years of school against my parents' wishes. They wanted me to study accounting. My grandpa wanted me to be a doctor, but I was like very passionate about journalism after taking a high school course. And so I went to school, studied journalism, and knew I wanted to do business journalism. So I really tried to find a minor that complemented my major. So I studied finance for my minor, which, like, looking back, I'm like, did I really learn so much in those classes? But listen, like, I was trying to become a business journalist. I did what I could. And I got connected to LinkedIn my junior year. So, funny story, actually. I was abroad in Italy, junior year, 2020. So the pandemic hits, I get sent home early. But during that time, I had learned of LinkedIn's fellowship program with my school, Syracuse. And I was like, okay, LinkedIn has a news team. This is really cool because obviously business journalism, and that's what I'm interested in. So I totally missed the deadline for the fellowship because I was like trying to escape Italy and get home. And my career service rep had reached out and was like, hey, we saw you were interested in applying. Do you still want to submit? So I did. And thank God for her because otherwise I would have never gotten connected to LinkedIn. So I ended up getting the fellowship and worked on the team the summer after my junior year. And I just fell in love with the people that I was working with. I thought LinkedIn had a great culture and I loved being able to pursue business journalism with the backing of such an established company. So I went back to school for senior year and was part-time in the spring. And I was like, I got to kill some time. Like, what am I going to do? So I had reached back out to the team since I had maintained those connections and started working part-time in a contract role. Long story short, and I know this has been like the longest story ever, so sorry, but I then started working full-time hours once I graduated, and then a full-time role opened up at LinkedIn the fall after I graduated. So I went through the interview process because it was on a different team, but within the editorial space, and I got the job. So that was really exciting. And I think it came at a very interesting time in my post-grad journey because when the fall rolled around, I was like, whoa, this is interesting. Like, I was so used to the structure of college going back. Like, I was getting those back to school vibes, but I wasn't going back to school. But I was starting, a new position. And it was really exciting. But I definitely think joining, the workforce during the pandemic, starting my first job remotely was really challenging because I felt, I was missing out on a lot of in-person connection and opportunities and totally felt a lot of loneliness during that time. But luckily, we're able to experience the in-office culture now, which has been, for me, I really love it. But yeah, that's a bit about my post-grad journey.
Oh my gosh, I love it. And so you said something really interesting when you were landing first into journalism, like obviously everything you said was interesting, but when you were landing first into journalism, you mentioned a little bit about opposition you had around you. So I'm assuming you
Mhm.
didn't really grow up with other journalists around you.
No. I think my whole family could like have their own accounting firm at this point because everyone studied accounting. My brother, my sister, my dad, my cousin, like everyone's an accountant. So when I wanted to do journalism, my family was like, okay, you'll make no money and we have no connections to help you. And obviously, at the time, I really didn't realize how important that saying, like, it's who you know, not what you know, really is. And I've definitely recognized the value of networking throughout college and into my post grad career. But at the time, I was like, I will figure it out. Like, I will do what I need to do to land a job. But yeah, I ended up landing a job through my school and through the network I had built. So yeah, they weren't too happy, but now my mom's like, "I'm so proud of you. You really showed us all that you could do it."
I feel like you went through the rite of passage. It's like every
Yeah.
post grad person has to disappoint their parents. I say
Yeah.
that with quotation marks, like in some way. Like I have a biology degree, and look at what I'm doing now. Like I
Oh
do
my
not
god.
do
I love that.
doctorate
Okay,
stuff.
but, like, there's so many things you probably learned in that degree that, like,
Yeah.
you can apply to your job. It's all about, those transferable skills and knowledge.
No, definitely. So, you mentioned a little bit about the loneliness. Like, you went from being in Italy, just being at the height of the pandemic, to now being thrust in this post grad journey. How did you sort of navigate that loneliness, especially when it came to starting this new job and entering a whole new world, per se?
Yeah. I was able to lean on a lot of my friends at that time because all of us were starting remotely. And it was also
Hmm.
a really weird experience because we didn't know any better. Like, I had never really worked in a traditional office before. So I didn't even know what I was missing out on. And I'm sure like a lot of people can relate to that.
Hmm.
So it was mostly leaning on my friends during that time. And with that, it's kind of like a double-edged sword because then you're comparing yourself to other people and maybe
Yeah.
some of them like aren't having that experience. And I'm like, oh, what's wrong with me? But when I think back to like the relationships I've built on the team that go back to like, you know, 2021, a lot of them were born out of remote work. And I think
Hmm.
one, it was just like everyone was kind of looking for bonds at that time. But I think I definitely bonded with people who were just joining the company at the same time. So we both were onboarding remotely. So yeah, I think that was the biggest thing is just leaning on people who were having a similar experience. And then once we got into the office, really taking advantage of whatever like in-person opportunities we had to team build and pushing myself even at the beginning when I was living at home and the commute was longer. I was like, I'm going to go in because I see the value of being able to get in front of other people and just build those bonds in person.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely a big part of being part of return to office. I know that some people hate it and some people want to be completely remote, but really being in front of other people is where you're able to have a lot of career opportunities. And even back to your story a little bit earlier, you mentioned just the relationships that you're able to have with your career services person who is then able to position you for this opportunity. So you mentioned a lot about networking and hustling. And I think that feeds into the return to work culture, even if you're on like a hybrid schedule. I don't know if some people are completely online. I think you're hybrid, right?
Yeah, I'm hybrid.
Yeah. Okay, for sure. But I want to move back a little bit into you landing your job, your actual position at LinkedIn,
Hmm.
and also just the advice that you give people when it comes to landing their first job. Just because in 2020 it was hard, it's hard right now,
Hmm.
and people are facing rejection after rejection after rejection.
Yeah.
So when you were going into specifically journalism and business journalism, how did you navigate landing your first job, the interview process, following up? Like, what's your play by play?
Yeah. Okay, so I feel like I was just like rejected by everywhere. Like it was I definitely took the strategy of like mass apply. And what's interesting about studying journalism is like you're kind of sold on two different career paths. Like you're
Mhm.
either going to go to a local station in the state that you did not grow up in, or you're going to go work for like the New York Times or the Journal right out of school. And I was like, like, where will I fall? Is there an in between? And so when the opportunity at LinkedIn came up, I was like, okay, this is completely unique. I never expected to be working as a journalist at a tech company. So it was a bit of, kind of despite it being such an incredible opportunity and I was like pinching myself about it, I had to kind of realign my expectations because I was targeting like big media publications and I had only imagined myself starting my career there because that's all that I thought was possible. And I feel like when you are in college, you don't know what you don't know. I mean, that goes through all of life, but like you're only exposed to kind of what like your career service center is telling you and you kind of think on such like a micro scale when there's so many jobs out there and there's so many like interesting jobs at different companies that you wouldn't even anticipate. So, even though I'm a journalist, I work in tech. I don't work in traditional media. And that's something that I didn't expect. So I just kind of had to like realign those expectations. But yeah, before I knew that I was going to be able to join LinkedIn again after my fellowship, I was just pretty much mass applying anywhere. And all of us were competing for the same internships. I definitely didn't realize the value of like building your brand during that time. And I was very focused on my resume, my cover letter, kind of crafting my narrative of why I want to pursue business journalism and how my experience, translates to the roles I'm targeting. But I definitely did also lean into networking, especially with people who were in the roles that I wanted that were around my age. So somebody who like had the fellowship or somebody who was an early career reporter at whatever publication I was targeting. I definitely leaned into that just to understand like a bit about, what can I do to help me stand out. Yeah, but a lot of rejection. None of those jobs really led to anywhere. And I went on interviews. I was so nervous. Oh my God. I think back and I'm like, Jesus, what was I even saying in those interviews? I was just so nervous because I felt, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, like I'm not bringing anything to the table. And during the time when I was looking, because it was 2020, 2021, it was so competitive
Mhm.
with us competing with 2020 grads. The job market was not doing well in general, and entry level jobs, were taking a hit. So I just felt like whatever opportunity I got, I had to be super grateful for. And ultimately, that led to me getting connected back to LinkedIn, which was great, and getting a full time position, going through the interview process internally. But that mindset of like I'm just grateful to have a job definitely holds you back when it comes to advocating for yourself during the interview, during the negotiation. And that's something I look back on and I'm like, wow, I've learned a lot.
Okay, key gem just dropped there. I feel like just being grateful
Yeah.
is the fastest path to just settling with how much you get paid, with what kind of opportunities you get, for how you speak up for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You said a lot of really interesting things just now. I think the first is about the interview process. When you're
Yeah.
young and you're just getting starting out, interviews can be nerve-wracking. Of course, you and I, we do interviews a lot now, just interviewing other
Mm-hmm.
people. You're on the other side of it right now, and so you developed confidence with it over time. But when you're being interviewed for the first time, specifically in a job setting, I feel like sometimes people feel like they're being scrutinized
Mm-hmm.
and they feel like there's a big spotlight under them. So, what advice would you give to your past self who was in all those interviews before you actually landed the role that would be what you've grown into now?
I would say, girl, chill. Like you're not okay. Like, why are you rambling so much? No, I'm kidding. I think the biggest it's a mindset shift of exactly what you just said. When you feel like I'm in the hot seat, of course I'm gonna be like freaking out, right? But when you look at it like, okay, it's a conversation. I am interviewing this company as much as they're interviewing me. So I need to come prepared with questions and look at it like a two-sided conversation. When you do that, then it takes away just the scariness of feeling like you're being interrogated, honestly, and like they're trying to find out something about you and like they're gonna like get you for not having the experience. Like you literally feel like they're gonna find out, and that's like the imposter syndrome, I'm sure, of like, oh, they're gonna find out I'm not qualified. So you feel like then you start rambling, like Lord knows I did that. So I think it's like one, shifting your mindset of viewing it as a conversation and doing a lot of work ahead of time to build your confidence going in. There's so much interview prep that you can do. And I think the biggest thing is feeling confident about articulating your career story. When I look back, I'm like, what did I even say in interviews? And now when I'm like sharing with my friends, my best friend's sister was just looking for a job. She just graduated. So we had a lot of calls ahead of time. I was prepping her for all the interviews. And immediately it's like a lot of people feel the need to go like, oh, this is everything, this is who I am, this is what I bring to the table, this is what I'm looking for. It's like, no, take a step back and be able to articulate like who you are, what you're passionate about, what you're interested in, what experiences you do have, and expand that experience beyond traditional work. So a lot of my friends didn't have internships because of the pandemic. So, what coursework could be relevant on a resume that you can speak to? What volunteer work did we do? What on campus involvements did we have? What leadership positions did we hold at school? Being able to kind of like own that as experience and being able to articulate it in a way that relates to your role, I think gives you so much confidence because you don't feel like, oh, I'm coming in with no experience. Like you have experience that is valid. You just need to expand your definition of experience. And once you do and really realize how much you're bringing to the table and be able to articulate how it applies to the roles that you're targeting, you will feel so much more confident going in. And I think that coupled with the viewing it as a conversation is just chef's kiss.
Yes, 100% yes. And I think you bring up such an interesting point in addition to that, having the volunteer experience and so on. But somewhere around 40% of recruiters view volunteer experience the same as actual work experience. And there are so many ways to showcase those skills and quantify them and actual impact. So all these skills can definitely be used to add to your toolbox. And then when we're thinking about presenting this as a beautiful package, you talked a little bit about where you're actually able to find these opportunities. And you talked about knowing all of these big companies and some media publications, but everyone was going after those. Everyone wants to have like a big, sexy name behind them, especially for their first job. Is there any way or resource that you would recommend to up and coming journalists or people who want to pivot into journalism that they can find more of a bank of lesser known journalism jobs to go after instead of maybe just plucking off what comes off the top of their head?
I think it all comes down to doing your research about what opportunities are out there and not looking so much at like something I wish I did is I didn't just target media, right? Like
Mhm.
I could be working in an editorial position in tech, in finance, in whatever industry, in healthcare. So I think you almost have to like look at your job function of like, okay, I want to be in an editorial position, I want to be a reporter, or I want to be a producer, whatever it might be, and then see what opportunities are there in other industries besides just like big media. And you'll be really surprised to find out like how many companies have editorial teams. And I always say like you have to let go of the pressure of landing that big first fancy job. Like your career is so long and I don't think you realize that until you start working. Like literally a year in, I was like, wow, we have like how many more
40 more
years of
years ago.
this? Like, whoa, 40 more years.
Yeah.
And you realize like, okay, this is just one job of many, or most likely, right? I know some people stay at their jobs for 10 plus years, but you're most likely going to have a lot of job opportunities throughout your career. So this first job is just a stepping stone. When you view it as that, the pressure kind of comes off to not land like the big flashy job. And I think the biggest thing there is you need to overcome the comparison trap, which is so hard. Like when your friends are posting about the big jobs they landed and everyone's talking about it, it can make you feel inferior. And you're like, well, why am I not getting that? Every experience is valid. So they're going to get a different experience at that company. You're going to get different experience wherever you end up, but both are valid and you will have some other opportunity after that. And that's why I think it's so important to like not so put so much pressure on that first job to be perfect because no job is, like,
No job
and I
is.
don't think any of us dream of like, we have like big dream jobs. I mean, I don't like dream of labor and I don't love the notion of a dream job because like it puts such unrealistic expectations on your work. And it turns out like even a job that you love has downsides. You're going to have your bad days even at a really good job.
Exactly. And I feel like at the end of the day, what you don't get in the big company name, you do end up getting in the actual work that you do and the skills
Mhm.
that you're able to learn while you're at that job. So for
Yeah.
example, if you go to a startup, you probably have a lot more opportunities to move up the ranks faster than a large company where there might be a lot more red tape. You might have the ability to lead more projects and so on. So if you don't get that big name right now, you are more than likely to get it further down the line because you also pick up tools like how to be scrappy and
Mhm.
how to be a leader and like leading your team, managing up, right? So it's very beneficial in that sense too.
Yeah, I know a lot of my friends who started out at smaller companies and they're like, I'm wearing a million hats. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing experience that you then have to leverage in whatever opportunity you go after, right? And honestly, each job just informs what you do and don't want in a next job. So if
Hmm.
you're in a role and you're like, oop, this is not it, okay, there's another opportunity out there. And now you know what you're looking for. Because again, like this is our first post grad job. You don't even know what you're really looking for, and that's totally okay. Like your non negotiables, your list of what you need out of a job is going to change throughout your career and it will most definitely change in that first year post grad because you're going to start to realize, oh, okay, I actually don't love this about a company and I actually do like this to inform your next role. And a lot of that you learn one in your role, but also as your friends go through their experiences, they'll tell you something and I'm like, "Oh, that would never fly at my company." Or like, "Oh, I love that your company does that." Right? So it's just all informative when you look for that next role because like I said before, it's just a stepping stone that first role.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I think in our 20s we have this huge problem with being like this is right now. Everything has to
Yeah.
happen right now. Like
Yeah.
putting it back to what you said about that comparison, but it's like just chill out. Like
Chill.
we got 40 plus more years of this.
Yeah, no, honestly, that's like the biggest realization when you realize that you're like, "Okay, I got time. I have time to
I
figure it
got
out." And
time.
like, listen, I don't think you retire having it figured it out. Like I think
No.
everyone's always learning, so.
Exactly. So if we go back to the story, where we left off is that you were interviewing, you gave some really awesome interview tips. So when you started the process of interviewing and landing the role at LinkedIn, I would love to hear how that went and also just transitioning into your first real role
Mhm.
post grad after
Yeah.
interning there too, because you did have that interesting story of being an intern there and then moving up into a full time position.
Yes. So I still went through the interview process. And I think for me, again, it was like resetting my expectations because I had been on a contract on this one team and then full time opportunities opened up on another team. And I had been very one track minded, thinking if I'm going to go full time, it's got to be on the team that I'm currently working on. Like I couldn't
Mhm.
even understand the scope of, the company at the time. Like I think when you join a big company, you don't realize like how big it is, honestly. Like
Yeah.
there's so many different teams, there's so many different roles. And so I was kind of one track minded. And then I'm very fortunate the manager I had at the time was like, Gianna, this is a really awesome opportunity. And like I wouldn't want to see you miss out on something because it's just not exactly what you had imagined. And he encouraged me to apply. And I'm very grateful that he did because I was able to land that role and land a full-time position. But going from intern or contractor to then, well, fellow to contractor to then full-time, uh, it was different because it was a new team within editorial and my role was kind of being designed as I was going. And I talk about this on the podcast that it's hard starting a new job in general, and I guess for me, the biggest learning curve was like, okay, I felt like I was starting with nothing. Like, I was able to build a newsletter. Shout out to the newsletter if you guys want to follow. It's called Let's Talk
Oh,
Offline, but there was a previous version before the podcast where I was building out a newsletter and all my content is by Gen Z for Gen Z. And so I knew what I had to do, but I didn't know how to get there. I was like, okay, like I don't even know what my metrics for success are. I don't know what the goals are. And a lot of that I figured out in conversations with my manager, but also finding kind of support and allies within my team. So I remember this one conversation I had with somebody who was my direct teammate at the time. And I was feeling overwhelmed. I was in this new role. It was kind of a blank slate. I knew what the end goal was, and I saw all other people surrounding me who had the success and they achieved that thing. And I'm like, how do I get there? And he was like, Gianna, take a step back again, chill, because she needs to chill, and figure out what your metrics for success are. Here's what's worked for me. Maybe that can work for you, but figure out what's best for you in this role and then put that somewhere. Track your success, track your wins so that if somebody asks, you can answer. And I think that was the greatest advice I could have received because it helped me kind of one, set goals for myself, figure out how to benchmark myself, and then be able to show up to my one-on-one meetings with my manager and say, here's what I've been doing to work toward these goals. do these, you think these goals are best? Is there anything I should change and shift, and like bringing them in as a partner in my goals. But yeah, I think the hardest thing about transitioning was feeling like I was starting over in a sense,
Mhm.
and then figuring out, okay, in this new role, what are the metrics for success as it's kind of being figured out as I go.
Mhm. You said a couple of really interesting things there. And as you share this story about you navigating being the first, because a lot of us in these new positions are the first, and you
Hmm.
here being trailblazer as the first early career development editor at LinkedIn. But you said something interesting in the sense that I'm going to make my manager a partner in my goals.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of times people think of their manager or their boss as this big brother type of figure,
Yeah.
just like looking not down at you, but almost trying to keep you in line. You've reframed it to be like, since I am the first, I'm going to make them a partner in my goals. And with through making them a partner in my goals, I can get to wherever the metaphorical finish line is sooner rather than
Yeah.
later.
The other thing that also is a bit challenging for me at first was that this was a very self-driven role, and I luckily was given so much freedom to kind of figure out what was going to work best. And I feel very fortunate that my manager and team trusted me to, figure out how to best serve my audience, and really lean into my own experience and trust my gut with that. But being it was such a self-driven role was also really challenging because I had, it was like up to me to
Mhm.
figure it out. And I definitely felt that pressure.
So, when you're speaking with your managers and your teams and you are the first in this sense, I'm sure you have to ask for help a good amount of times. And I know for me, asking for help used to make me cringe. Like, why can't I just figure
Hmm.
out how to do this? So, what are your tips when it comes to someone asking for help? Maybe they're in the same position that you are in, but they don't want to feel like they're being too needy. What advice would you give them?
Okay, asking for help in a virtual world made me cringe too, because I was like, I'm paying you nonstop and I'm sorry. And I would apologize nonstop. Listen, like, you are figuring out a role. You should not feel like you're a nuisance. And now, being somebody who's into my career, when somebody joins and they ask me questions, I'm like, oh, I love how eager they are to learn. I never view it as like you are like being annoying. So I think one, it's like just kind of assume best intentions, that everybody's there to help you. But I do think I leaned on like a few specific people and kind of view them more as like mentors almost. I think when you're new in a role and other people have kind of carved out their own space, I kind of positioned it as like, I have a lot to learn and I really admire the way that you've gotten to where you are. Can you kind of like bring me in under your wing to help me figure out like what steps I can be taking to get to whatever, spot that I need to go. So I definitely leaned on mentorship in that time, and like more informal mentorship relationships with my teammate, literally being vulnerable and saying, there's a lot I need to figure out. And at times I'm getting overwhelmed by not knowing what the next step is and what's the first step I should take. And is this the right strategy? And am I bringing the right people? Am I doing the right thing? Can you kind of help shed some light on what you did to help you get to the point that you're at? So I think that was a really big thing. And you honestly have to just get comfortable asking questions, because I've definitely sat there and racked my brain trying to figure something out. And I'm like, okay, well, now I wasted an hour and I totally could have just asked that and it would have been solved in 5 minutes. And I really do think the barrier is less when you're in office, and I could be like, hey, really quick, do you have a minute? I get it that like paying people nonstop can feel like you're annoying them. But I do think you have to just assume best intent, that everyone's there to help. And if they're, getting annoyed by you asking for help so much, maybe you can say like, hey, can we have, maybe it's with your manager and you're picking up on a vibe. Like, we all can pick up on tones, but I will say over Slack or teams, you can't really pick on up on tones. You don't know how things are being, how they're being intended. But you could say like, hey, like, can we have like a weekly one-on-one? Maybe you save all your questions for then and you kind of like use that as working time with your manager or mentor, whatever it might be.
No, definitely. And there is no virtue in struggling.
No.
There's no virtue in struggling at all. I find that a lot of times it's the people who like put on a brave face and just ask the questions, they get to where
Yeah.
they want to get so much faster.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are just confident in that, like I think we all have something to learn from people like that, and also the tips that you just gave. But I do want to switch gears for a little bit because just the nature of your job, it's so fascinating to me because you have built this huge public persona. Gianna first had a newsletter called Keeping the Balance. I think it grew to around 20,000 subscribers
Mhm.
or maybe a little more. Yeah. And so now it's pivoted to Let's Talk Offline, which is that podcast I mentioned that she has with LinkedIn News and in partnership with iHeartRadio. And so for a lot of people, I don't think they move into a job necessarily expecting to be public. And I think a lot of people face like the fear of being seen. But as you mentioned, building a personal brand and being intentional about building a personal brand earlier on was what helped you get this amazing role that you have and build the amazing career that you have. So, what are some tips and pieces of advice for people who want to maybe start posting, but might be a little bit scared, want to start putting themselves out there, especially people who might want to pivot into journalism?
Okay. The fear of being seen is so real. It took me a very, very long time to feel comfortable being on camera, getting used to the sound of my own voice. Like, I study news. I always say this. I study newspaper journalism for a reason. I wanted a byline. I didn't want people to like know my face or, any of that. And I've been very grateful and fortunate to have been given such an amazing platform with LinkedIn. But it definitely took me a minute. And even still, I mean, we talk offline about the imposter syndrome I face in the role, and I think a lot of us experience early in our careers. But I think the first thing is like you're to acknowledge like you're totally valid in your feelings of I'm scared to put myself out there. I still am. Like it is tough because you feel like you're opening yourself up to criticism, and it's true. I've talked myself out of posting so many times because I've said, "Oh my god, are these thoughts just dumb? Will anyone ever relate to this? Do I sound stupid?" Like I've just not posted things more about my personal experience, my personal journey, because I've been like, maybe people aren't going to get it. And I've realized since starting my career that a lot of our experiences are not unique. We go through so many of the same challenges of other people. And I think when like we're entering the workforce during a time where like generations are pinned against each other, it makes you feel like you kind of can't say things. But I speak to so many people at work who are, millennials. My co-host Jahleane is a millennial, and we can relate on so much. And so once you start putting yourself out there, and let's say you want to post about your personal journey, whatever that might be, right? Navigating the post grad transition, figuring out, how to navigate your first role, your experiences, one, are valid. And also people are going to be able to relate to you and feel seen. And I have new grads reach out all the time who are like, I want to get started with posting, but I just don't know if I should put myself out there. And I'm like, there's so much we can learn from each other's experiences. And the biggest thing is just to feel validated in our own. And I'm like, once you post and one person comments, like, oh my God, I can so relate to this, or I feel seen, you start to feel really encouraged to keep going. So it's all just about getting started. But I totally hear people on that hurdle of hitting post. I mean, I've been there. So it's all about just like taking whatever first step feels comfortable for you. And if you feel pressure to do it, like maybe your company's pressuring you, that's something you should assess. If you're putting the pressure on yourself, take a deep breath and realize, okay, if this does not feel authentic to you, this does not feel natural, it's not something you have to do. But if it's something that you're feeling this urge to like, I want to share my story, I want to get more into content creation, you just have to do it once, and slowly you will get more comfortable with it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that. And especially when you do hit that wall when it comes to finally hitting post. I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times people get caught up in the metrics like, oh my
Oh,
God,
yeah.
it's been an hour and it has one like. Learn
Post
like
and literally exit out. Like, get out of there.
exit out.
Don't look. Don't
Don't look,
look.
run. I
Yeah,
feel
run away.
I feel like such a good rule of thumb, which I think we've talked about, is like if you liked the post when you posted it before any validation came in, you should like
Hmm.
it no matter how much validation comes
I
in,
love that.
which
Yeah.
is, I think, where we are might be ending today.
Yeah. And tag us because we'll like it.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely like your post if you're listening. Tag this.
Yeah.
But Gianna, I think we're almost out of time. But You've been such a fantastic guest. I know people have so much to learn from you. Are there any other lasting piece of advice that you would give to someone who might be looking to pivot, is really looking for a career in journalism, but overall an early career professional, that you would say this is my number one piece of advice I would give you?
I'd say just to lean into your skills and to not discount your experience. If you're coming from another industry and you're trying to pivot into journalism, I'm sure whatever industry you're coming from, you have so many transferable skills that will set you up for success in whatever role you're targeting. It's just being able to identify those skills, identify the unique experiences that you bring, and then articulate them in an interview. But I think the biggest thing is just to not, don't undervalue yourself. You bring so much value to the table. Once you recognize the unique, value that you're bringing and you're able to speak confidently about it, you're going to do totally fine. So I would just say to not discount your experience, to really lean into what makes you unique and then be able to articulate it, in a job interview, in networking calls, whatever it might be. And also,
Period.
everybody's figuring it out. So anybody who seems like they have it figured out, they don't. Okay. That's the biggest secret.
Literally no
We're
one.
all figuring it out.
We're all figuring it out, period. Well, thank you so much, Gianna. This was absolutely lovely. I know that I always learn from you when I'm with you, and it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. But
Thank you.
everyone, make sure you stay up to date. It doesn't have to be the last time you hear from Gianna. Like I mentioned, she has a newsletter podcast called Let's Talk Offline. She is also posting consistently and regularly on LinkedIn, just Gianna Prudente. You can just find her really easily. But thank you so much for coming on again. And everyone else, I will see you next week.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Amazing.